The Golden Age. The end of the Persian Wars marked the beginning of the Golden Age of Greece. After King Xerxes burned Athens, the ruler of Athens ordered that the city be rebuilt, making it a beautiful place to live. Remember reading about Athens last week? You learned that the Athenians encouraged visitors and thinkers to come to their marketplace, or agora. While the Athenians and their visitors shopped at the agora, they also shared ideas. New ideas like democracy and trial by jury emerged, and the city of Athens began to flourish. Flourish means to grow and prosper. Pericles once said, "Our city is open to the world." This openness helped make Athens the place to live. Pericles led Greece during the time historians call the Golden Age. That time is also known as the Age of Pericles. Pericles built the beautiful Parthenon, a temple to honor the goddess Athena. Pericles created a city that was a center of learning, art, and culture. He ruled Athens for 30 years. We can thank the ancient Greeks for our form of government. The word democracy comes from the Greek words for people rule. The government of ancient Greece was a direct democracy. This means all citizens voted on all issues. More than 40,000 male citizens were part of the lawmaking body. About every 2 weeks, thousands of citizens came together to vote. Pericles wanted both wealthy and poor citizens to be part of the government. However, only free men over 18 could vote. We call our democracy a representative democracy. A direct democracy would not be practical in the United States. There are too many people and they live too far apart. Instead, citizens of the U.S. elect people to represent them. Our democracy is also different from the ancient Greeks because all adult citizens can vote, regardless of their race or gender. Even though you're not old enough to vote yet, elected officials from your community represent you. You have a voice. What are some issues you feel strongly about? You can write a letter to members of Congress and let your voice be heard. Who gets the ancient Greek statues? The Greek government would argue that the saying finders keepers doesn't exactly work in the real world, especially when it comes to ancient Greek art. Recently, officials in the government have requested that some ancient marble statues, called the Elgin marbles, be returned to Greece where they originally came from. The statues are in England right now. Although the debate has been going on for a while, the new request was sparked by a completion of a new museum in the city of Athens, Greece. The government would like to house the sculptures with other related sculptures there. During the early 1800s, British Ambassador Thomas Bruce, who was the Earl of Elgin, received permission from the ruling authorities at the time to remove the statues and transport them to England. They have been in a museum there for more than 200 years. Since that time, there's been a lot of argument over who owns the marbles and whether it was right to take them from their original home. As this recent request would indicate, the debate continues today. The marble sculptures are famous pieces of art that used to be part of one of Greece's most famous buildings, the Parthenon. The Parthenon is a huge temple built more than 2,400 years ago that still stands today in Athens. It was built to honor Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom and war. The marbles were located on a section of the temple called the pediment. Greek civilization flourishes. When you think of cities in the US that are political and cultural centers, which cities do you think of? Maybe New York City or Washington, D.C.? In ancient Greece, that city was Athens. Let's look at some of the highlights of the Golden Age of Greece and how, like all good things, it eventually came to an end. The Agora. Today, you might go to the mall to shop, eat, see a movie, and mingle with friends. In ancient Greece, people in Athens went to the Agora. It was the center of the city, its marketplace. It was a place where travelers came to share their goods and information about the outside world. The Agora was where people like Socrates loved to spend time, talking with people and teaching. The Agora was about the size of several football fields and was always very busy. School days. Boys went to school at the age of 7, while girls stayed home with their mothers. The schools were called gymnasia, meaning training grounds in Greek, where boys learned math, writing, and reading. Teachers were called grammatistes. Grammatistites. Instead of paper, boys wrote on wooden tablets covered with wax. They used a stylus, a writing tool made of metal or bone. Students wrote their lessons in the wax with the sharp tip of the stylus. If they made a mistake, they used the other blunt end to smooth the wax so the tablet could be reused. Let's go to the theater. The Greeks loved going to outdoor theaters or amphitheaters, which were shaped in a semicircle. One well known amphitheater was Epidaurus. It seated more than 14,000 people. The Greeks created sad, serious plays called tragedies and funny plays called comedies. Famous playwrights included Euripides, Aeschylus, Aristophanes, and Sophocles. Only men or boys performed plays, and they usually wore large masks. Those masks had large openings for the mouths, which worked like megaphones to broadcast the actors' voices. The background scenery for the plays that hung on the stage were called skeins. Our word scenery comes from this Greek word. Architecture. Have you ever seen a picture of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C.? Its architecture or building style dates back to ancient Greece. The Greeks liked buildings with many giant columns. They developed three basic styles of columns. A plain but sturdy thin column was called a Doric column. An even thinner column with a scroll like top was called an Ionic column. A Corinthian column was a very fancy column with lots of carved leaves at the top. The Peloponnesian War. Rivalry, jealousy, and high taxes or tributes led Athens into the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC, when the Spartans began to fight the Athenians. The Peloponnesian War lasted 30 years. At first, the Athenians seemed to be winning the war. They built a wall around their city and harbor so their enemies could not enter the city. Athens also had a navy, while the other cities did not. The Spartans persuaded the Persians to give them money to build a navy. Remember the Persian Wars and how the Persians hated Athens? In exchange for the money, Sparta gave Persia some land in Asia Minor. Sparta eventually convinced other Greek city states and the Persians to join the fight. Together, they defeated the Athenian navy and forced Athens to surrender in 404 BC. The Spartans tore down the city walls and established their own government. The golden age of Athens had come to an end. The Trojan horse. Have you heard the story of a horse that helped win a war? Historians aren't sure if the Trojan War actually took place, but people have kept the story going through time. The great poet Homer wrote the Iliad, a poem about the Trojan War. The Greek cities of Sparta and Troy went to war. Troy was one of the cities along the coast of Asia Minor. The story says the son of the king of Troy came to see the king of Sparta, Menelaus. Menelaus' wife, Helen, left her husband for the handsome young son named Paris. He was angry that Helen went with Paris, so Menelaus sent 100,000 ships to fight against Troy. The war lasted for many years. Finally, the Spartans came up with a trick. They left a huge wooden horse outside of Troy's city walls. One Spartan stayed behind to tell the Trojans that the Spartans didn't want to fight any longer, and that the huge wooden horse was a peace offering. The people of Troy rejoiced. They thought the war was over and took the horse inside their city and partied that night. Some worried about the gift and said it was a trick. They were right. 30 Spartan soldiers had hidden inside the horse. That night, the Spartan soldiers crept out of the wooden horse and opened the city gates to let the rest of the Spartan army into the city. They killed the Trojan people and burned Troy to the ground. Socrates. Socrates was a Greek philosopher who lived between 469 and 399 BC. He spent his life pursuing knowledge. Socrates was a great thinker, even as a boy. He once told his father that a pitcher was just an arrangement of clay, that its use is what gave the pitcher beauty. Socrates spent his days at the Agora of Athens, walking among the people, chatting, questioning, and thinking. Socrates said he was different from others because he knew he was ignorant. He wanted to learn from others. People nicknamed Socrates the Great Questioner because he said that to learn, one must ask questions, lots of them. Socrates' most famous student was Plato, who also became a great thinker, philosopher, and teacher. Plato's most famous student was Aristotle. Aristotle is often called the father of science. He used his powers of observation to learn much about the world. As a teacher, Aristotle also had a very famous student. The young boy grew up to be Alexander the Great. As you can see, Socrates' influence continued through generations. Teaching got Socrates into a lot of trouble. The Greek government accused him of corrupting young minds and disrespecting the religious traditions of his day. They put Socrates on trial and found him guilty. They sentenced him to death by drinking a cup of poison hemlock. Socrates accepted his sentence because he believed in the idea of trial by jury and because the jury found him guilty. Even though Socrates had many opportunities to escape from jail, he did not. He took the poison to carry out the decision of the jury. Would you have done this? Can you understand why Socrates did this? What might have happened if Socrates, a respected citizen of Athens, had refused to accept his sentence? Would the idea of trial by jury have survived? Can the Parthenon be saved? The famous Parthenon is in trouble. Greeks built the Parthenon temple around 447 BC to honor the goddess Athena. The sculptor Phidias designed the Parthenon during the Golden Age of Greece. He used more than 20 tons of marble to build it. The temple was in good shape until AD 1687, when gunpowder that the Turks had stored in the temple ignited and blew up. Now, air pollution threatens the building's remaining 17 original sculptures. Painted scenes depicting the Trojan War and battles with gods and giants are almost unrecognizable. To save the sculptures, some in Greece would like to remove the sculptures and place them in a museum being constructed below the Acropolis, where the Parthenon is located. They want to replace the original sculptures with replicas. What do you think of this idea? Why? Meteoras of Greece. If you travel to Thessaly in central Greece, you'll come upon a spectacular sight. Gigantic rocks rise high above the town of Kalamka. At the tops of these rocks, you'll see monasteries, places where men dedicate their lives to God, that are known as the Meteoras of Greece. Meteora is Greek for hover in the air. Men climbed these rocky peaks to try to be closer to God. Back in the 11th century, monks or holy men used ladders and baskets to bring supplies to the summit to build the monasteries. The monks living in the monasteries kept the Greek culture alive when the Turks occupied Greece between AD 453 and 1829. In addition to their religious activities, the monks copied hundreds of books, which they kept in their libraries. Until the early 1900s, the only way to get to these monasteries was still by baskets and ladders. But now roads and steps have been built. 6 of the monasteries are still active.